Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Political State Podcast. I'm Ben Felder with the Oklahoman, and joining me as always is my colleague Carmen Forman. We're recording this on Thursday, February 24th. A couple of days of winter weather had shut down the Capitol, but we still saw some things happen earlier this week, Carmen, that we'll get into today. But right now, like most lawmakers, we are bunkered down at home with a couple inches of snow on the ground and a quiet state capitol.
Yeah, it's kind of a nice change of pace in the middle of session.
Yeah, definitely. After a few weeks into session, that kind of gives us a little bit of a chance to breathe, but still plenty of stuff to follow. And the Capitol was open earlier this week, including on Monday and Tuesday. On Monday, we saw public school advocates come for the Capitol. I think this is a week that's been designated as Public School Week or Public School Advocacy Week. And then also, we talked last week in the podcast about one of the big issues this year, which is the private school vouchers, or at least the vouchers that parents would be able to use if this legislation were passed for private school tuition, homeschool curriculum, some other home-based education services as well. It's being pushed in the Senate by Senate Pro Tem Greg Treat. We talked last week about how House Speaker Charles McCall had said at the start of session that it wasn't a bill that his caucus was interested in hearing. And we talked a little bit about the politics of that. But those who are advocating for it haven't given up, and including some outside groups. McCall's taking some pressure from some of those groups, including a DC group that's kind of been advocating for this and hasn't given up. What have we seen this year, or seen this week?
Yeah, so like you said, the DC-based Club for Growth, it's a conservative-leaning group. They've gotten involved in numerous Oklahoma elections, and although we're not quite at the election cycle part of this year yet, they seem to be taking on House Speaker Charles McCall because of his opposition to hearing this voucher bill in the House. And once again, the voucher bill is called the Oklahoma Empowerment Act from Senate Pro Tem Greg Treat. And so basically the Club for Growth paid for $25,000 at least. They said 1 week's worth of ads in McCall's district, which is in Atoka and around Atoka. And $25,000 worth of ads will buy you a fair amount in that part of the state. And the Club for Growth also was sending out mailers to what they described as pro-school choice advocates in Charles McCall's district. And the mailers and the ads basically attack the speaker for saying he's not going to hear this bill, and that encourages folks in his district to call his office and demand that he hear the Oklahoma Empowerment Act.
Yeah, so feeling some pressure from those groups. I also noticed the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, a conservative think tank. They put out a bunch of articles and pieces on promoting school choice. In fact, one of the arguments that they made was that we're hearing from House members who are against the voucher bill saying, hey, we already approved open transfer last year that took away some of the barriers to transfer to other schools. There have been some reporting earlier this year that there hadn't been a lot of demand so far for that open transfer. I think only a few hundred students across the state have taken advantage. And I saw an article that OCPA put out saying, well, that's proof that we need this, that you keep saying that you did open transfer, but not many students are using it. So we need to go another step forward. There hasn't been any votes in the House. Obviously, the bill's still in the Senate, but has there been any indication from you? I mean, have you observed anything that makes you think that pressure is getting to McCall or members of the House?
Honestly, I don't necessarily think the pressure would get to McCall. I think he's been elected in his district numerous times, and I think he has a good pulse on what his constituents want him to do. The only way I could really see the House changing course and maybe taking up this bill is if it were significantly amended. Let's say, if it were limited to urban areas, or if there were just something to put the rural lawmakers at ease, because what we saw last week when the Club for Growth was attacking Speaker McCall, his rural colleagues in the House are coming out in his defense, basically saying, our rural constituents do not want this.
Yeah, yesterday I spoke for another story with Representative Danny Sterling, who's the chair of the Rural Caucus. And we were talking about a variety of issues, priority issues for rural members. And this was one, objecting to this bill. And even after the pressure that McCall had been facing, I mean, he still, Representative Sterling still sounded very resolute, said that his members of the rural caucus, especially in the House, were still adamantly opposed to this. And as we've talked about before, he said, hey, public schools are the cultural center of a lot of our communities. I mean, this is where, we go for ball games and theater performances, and many people work at the school. They're often the biggest employers. And so as much as we've seen public schools kind of come under attack in recent years, and I think that's fair to say that we've seen that, especially from Republican legislatures across the country. Public schools are still pretty popular, especially in rural communities, and that's one thing we saw. And we saw some of that popularity this week with public school advocates that came to the Capitol, and it's hard to judge based on just social media. But I did find, it did seem like there were lots of lawmakers, both in the legislature and statewide members, as obviously Superintendent Hoffmeister, Labor Commissioner Leslie Osborne appeared at some of these events. I even saw Matt Pinnell. He wasn't at an event, but the lieutenant governor kind of tweeted his support for public schools, talking about his kids going to public school. So while the charter or the voucher advocates maybe have gotten some wind with some of these ads, those that are opposed in public school space, I thought had a pretty good showing this week as well.
I agree, but on the other side of things, you'll also notice that the governor is going out and essentially doing a full court press, trying to advocate for pro tem treats bill. I mean, I think I saw him on Fox Business, maybe this week or last week, which I don't know why Fox Business is interested in charter school reform, but that's a whole nother question. But in the segment, Governor Stitt was talking about why he thinks Oklahoma needs this legislation to pass. He's done, I think, at least one podcast interview to talk about it. And of course, this is catering to a more conservative audience, not necessarily he's talking to Oklahomans, but the more conservative leaning Oklahomans.
Yeah, and we talked about in last week's episode about how this could just be a campaign issue, that if Stitt were to win re-election and that Ryan Walters, his education secretary, he's been pushing for this voucher bill, if he were to win the superintendent race, then maybe this gives them kind of a mandate for next year to do something with. And who knows, like you said, maybe the bill gets tweaked and it does get a hearing in the House, or it does, some version of this does get passed. We also talked about maybe this is a bargaining chip for McCall. It's a pretty big one, I think. I don't know that I would say that this would be a bargaining chip, but it is interesting when you see the governor, pushing for legislation, and to see so much resistance within his own party. Definitely is something that draws a lot of attention.
Yeah, but it's also interesting too. I mean, if you just think about how government is set up to work, and a lot of people, maybe don't understand this, but like big reforms are not intended to pass in 1 year at the legislature. I mean, let's just look at what the legislature's been trying to do on medical marijuana reforms. It's taken years for them to do much of anything. And now they say that they're really committed to reforming Oklahoma's medical marijuana laws. But the state question passed more than 3 years ago. So to push such a big school reform in 1 year would be quite a feat. And I think that's part of what McCall's argument is in all of this, is that basically we need more discussion on such a big change.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So maybe this is, go big, take small steps as a compromise, and then build on it in the years to come. But it doesn't seem like the pro voucher group is giving up yet. So we're continuing to see them fight for that. And it'll be interesting to see if they are able to make some headway in the weeks to come. Something else that we saw earlier this week is we saw the advancements of several abortion bills in the Senate. Carmen, you reported on that, and we're in the Senate committee hearing. So, what do we see on the anti-abortion front?
Yeah, it doesn't really come as any surprise. I mean, Oklahoma, since Republicans took control of the state and the state legislature, have pretty much every year pushed back and introduced anti-abortion bills. This year, the biggie, or a couple of the biggies, are, there are several bills that want to copy the restrictive abortion law down in Texas. That's the one that prohibits most abortions after a quote unquote fetal heartbeat is detected. That can usually be detected around 6 weeks, but that's really early into a pregnancy. A woman may not know she's pregnant at 6 weeks. And then in conjunction with that, in copying the Texas law, we'll see these bills that basically empower individuals to essentially rat out or report on folks who perform an abortion for a woman after that 6-week period or after that fetal heartbeat is detected, or who helps a woman in some way, whether it's a financial helping or whether it's finding them a doctor to get an abortion after that cutoff period. So a bill like that advanced in the Senate this week. That's from Senator Julie Daniels. There's a companion bill in the House. But reproductive rights groups are really sounding the alarm on that, as well as a bill from Senate Pro Tem Greg Treat that would prohibit abortions 30 days after the start of a woman's last menstrual cycle. So whereas the quote unquote heartbeat bill would seem to halt most abortions after about 60 days, Treat's bill would limit most abortions after 30 days. And again, that's very early in a pregnancy. Women with, I guess, unpredictable menstrual cycles may not know that they're pregnant 30 days in. But, as the Senate Pro Tem, that bill is going to get a lot of traction and is very likely to pass. And if it does pass and get signed into law, I would say it's ripe for a lawsuit.
Yeah, but when that committee meeting was taking place earlier this week, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember which day, but it was the committee room outside. I noticed that there was a heavy law enforcement presence, and that they had kind of roped off an area, and they were kind of prepared for protesters. And the thing that was striking to me is I didn't see any. I'm not saying there weren't any in the building, but at least right outside the chamber, there weren't protesters on either side of this issue. And we have seen some demonstrations this year, but it doesn't seem like we've seen maybe as much as we've seen in past years. And I almost wonder if there's just kind of this feeling, obviously not just in Oklahoma, but across the country, that with the recent changes on the Supreme Court, it seems like we're kind of, at least it feels like we're headed towards reality where Roe v. Wade will be struck down, and that states like Oklahoma will be able to abolish abortion because of the makeup of their legislature. Does it feel like that's just kind of, I don't know, am I wrong in what I've observed? It just seems like there's been a little bit less advocacy on either side. There's been some, but it just kind of feels like, we're kind of headed to that. And who knows what the Supreme Court will ultimately rule. Obviously, we're guessing based on the current makeup of the court and the recent changes, but it just feels like that's kind of where we're headed.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, there definitely seems to be sort of a defeated feeling among reproductive rights groups and abortion providers. I wouldn't say that they're like giving up entirely. Yeah. I mean, they're still, criticizing these bills and hoping they don't pass. But there's already talk of like, if Roe v. Wade falls, trying to get women to states that will still have abortions, and trying to provide resources for that. And there's, like there usually is, there's talk of lawsuits, right? If these bills pass, because the Supreme Court could decide that the Roe v. question as a whole, or it could simply decide the question that Mississippi is sort of asking, which is, can a state prohibit an abortion after 15 weeks? And so if the court just rules on that, as opposed to the broader Roe v. Wade decision, then, groups can still sue over, say, laws that would prohibit abortions after 30 days. But I also, going back to your point on, sort of the roped off area in front of the committee, I don't think that was for, people that are proponents of abortion. That was more for the abolitionist side of things. And I think that has also driven our Republican lawmakers to file abortion bills that will severely limit abortions. The abolitionists are on the side where they think basically all abortions should be outlawed in cases of rape, incest, even saving the life of the mother. They don't believe any abortion should ever be performed. And, our Republican state leaders, namely Greg Treat, has basically said, that's unfeasible. While Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land. If we did that, we'd basically be seceding from the Union. But I think those people, the abolitionists, have put pressure on people like Greg Treat to show that they're doing something on the anti-abortion front.
Yeah, I think you make a great point that in recent years, the most protesters we've seen on this issue have been on the anti-abortion side. Not to say that we haven't seen pro-abortion right advocates at the Capitol, we have, but they just seem to be the loudest and mobilized the most. And often a lot of children in the crowd. And so I don't know if these are like just, homeschool families, a lot of them that have the ability to come up to the Capitol during the day. I mean, they have been loud and vocal. And in years past, there's been a lot of criticism towards Republican leaders. It's been interesting to see in the state where where the Republican legislature is almost uniformly against abortion, there still has been some friction between like you said, the abolitionists and Republican leaders who said, yes, we're against abortion too, but there's a constitutional way to do this, and even an ethical way to do this. I think there even are still some Republican members that would say, hey, there are some valid exceptions, and it'll be interesting to see what the legislature, what exceptions, if any, this legislature is willing to grant if Roe v. Wade were to be struck down.
Yeah, it even in Julie Daniels's bill that the so-called copycat bill from Texas. I mean, she basically says, okay, so private citizens can attempt to sue people who aid and abet a woman getting an abortion after this specified cutoff period, but the women themselves, the woman seeking an abortion, cannot be sued. So there's still some protections for women, especially if it is to save their own lives and getting an abortion. So it is interesting to see, and it is interesting to wonder how much of those will remain if some of this legislation moves forward.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep watching that as we move forward in the session. Another thing that we saw earlier this week was the Board of Equalization met to certify kind of the final budget numbers, or at least the budget numbers that the legislature can use to put together a budget for fiscal year 2023. They met in December to kind of give what they think the numbers will be, and then in February is kind of the last time they meet. They'll meet again in June, but the budget will be done by then. So this is a chance for them to say, okay, here's the money that you're going to have to work with in the legislature. And not too surprising that the legislature will have about 10.5, a little under 10.5 billion to work with. That's a state record. So, revenues are increasing from the previous year. That does include about 1.3 billion in one-time funds. So those are carryover funds that, lawmakers have said, hey, if we use that money, that can't be for recurring expenses. It have to be things for like one-time costs, like infrastructure and that kind of thing. But the legislature has more money to work with this year. The one thing that was interesting to me in talking to the budget chairman for the House and the Senate right after the meeting, they continue to say they want a relatively flat budget this year. They continue to say they want to put more money into the state savings account, the rainy day fund, which is already at 2.5 billion. And Chairman Wallace of the House said that he wants to maybe put as much as 600 or 700 million more into the rainy day fund to continue to boost that up. There's been some talk of some increases in state trooper pay increases and maybe some increases for some state agencies. But despite the budget numbers we saw this week, we still haven't got a sense that this year's budget is going to be a huge increase in spending from what we saw last year.
Do you get the sense, though, that even though the budget chairs have said publicly, we want to have a flat budget and we don't anticipate spending a bunch more, that they're still getting lobbied, behind the scenes for, from various agencies saying, oh, we need a little extra funding here for this, or we need a little extra funding here for that?
Oh, definitely. And, one thing that Wallace said was that when you add up all the agency requests that have been made, the state agencies make their budget proposals, before the session, and those proposals are being worked on by subcommittees. It's $658 million more than what was budgeted last year. So there is enough money, I suppose, to give the agencies what they want, but not if you take into consideration maybe some of the tax cuts that will get approved, or maybe some state employee pay raises, like I said, like with troopers that might be approved. And some other things. So they've still been pretty consistent. It's still pretty early in the budget, negotiations, the game. Tuesday was the Board of Equalization meeting, and later that day, Roger Thompson, budget chair of the Senate, and Chairman Wallace were going to be meeting with Stitt's people for only the second time. They have a standing meeting every Tuesday, but that was only going to be their second time to meet this week. So we're still very early in the budget negotiations, and things could definitely change. One thing that was interesting in talking to Chairman Wallace after the meeting, it was the first time I had a chance to talk with him since I wrote kind of a big story a couple weeks ago about kind of the budget process that kind of looked at, there are some that see it as a very secretive process or that lacks transparency. I talked with Wallace for the story, and in the story, he said that he thought that it was a pretty transparent process. And he reiterated that again to me and kind of took exception to the story a little bit, actually called it an opinion piece. So he wasn't too happy with the story, but he said, we're meeting with, our subcommittee members are meeting with state agency leaders. That process is taking place right now. We're going to have conversations. So even though Thompson and Wallace have been pretty clear on what they'd like to see the budget look like this year in terms of the amount of spending, he also reiterated that no major decisions have been made. Now you can believe that or not, but there are probably going to be some things in this budget that we're not aware of right now that by the end of the session we're going to be talking about, and that's just how it always happens. So the session is very long, and new things come up and things change, and sometimes the biggest proposals are kind of kept secretive by legislative leaders until the closing weeks. So I do expect that there'll be some aspects of the budget that we talk about in May that we're not talking about now or necessarily on our radar. But from what we've heard from legislative leaders, I don't think we can expect these huge investments to be made in state agencies over what we've seen in previous years or the previous year.
Yeah, speaking of things being kept under wraps until the end, I do remember last year when the budget came out, or they announced the budget proposal, and there was the $50 million, the increase for the Oklahoma Opportunity Scholarship. Am I saying that right, Ben?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, and that was just like not something that had really been talked about all session, and then boom, it was just like this huge increase in the budget for it. So you're not wrong. I mean, there could be surprises later this session.
Well, and I think where the criticism comes for the lack of transparency, and I think where I think Wallace is right. The state agencies did in a public setting, make their budget proposals, and you get a chance to see these subcommittee leaders and members ask questions. So there is kind of a transparent process right now. But I think where the valid criticism comes of a lack of transparency is that the budget is usually budget proposal is usually made with just days to spare, and the legislature only has a few days to vote on it. And by that point, you really have to pick your battles, right? And you have to, you're at the end of session, you're ready to go home. If you're a member, do you want to fight the budget? And then two, can you whip up enough of your colleagues to, defeat a budget because you disagree with it? So I think that's where the valid criticism comes in the lack of transparency. We often see a proposal with just a few days to spare, and I would expect that to be the same this year. And so I think if you are looking at something, an addition to the budget that might be somewhat controversial or might normally bring a lot of debate, as a legislative leader, politically, you're probably wise to keep that close to the vest. And reveal it at the end, because you're probably not gonna face as much debate as you would if you were to say make the proposal in March. So I think you're exactly right there. So we've got the final budget numbers. We'll see where budget negotiations go from here. One final thing I wanted to talk about, the story that I'm working on for the next few days, is also taking a look at something that's been a pretty big topic in recent years in Oklahoma, and that's criminal justice reform bills. Obviously a few years ago, voters took some major steps in approving some reclassifications for crimes, increased the property value threshold for felonies from $500 to $1,000, reclassified some nonviolent drug offenses that led to a lot of hundreds of commutations. We saw the governor in his first year approve hundreds of commutations. So there's been this big push towards criminal justice reform, but it seems like in recent years that effort has kind of slowed down a little bit. We've seen members of the legislature that have said we've gone too far and are maybe trying to cut back on some of those changes. And one thing that was interesting earlier this week, Carmen, you and I had a chance to meet with some representatives from a national organization called Right on Crime, which is a conservative group advocating for criminal justice reform. And their leader told us that even the phrase criminal justice reform is kind of becoming taboo in some conservative circles, and they're having to fight with their own members, or at least debate with their own members about this perception that crime is on the rise, or that we've gone too far in this area, and yet there's more work to be done. So a story that I'm working on for the next few days is taking a look at a few criminal justice reform bills that are still making their way through the legislature this year. Two bills, one in the House and one in the Senate, were approved last week. One, I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head, but one reclassified some felony sentencing, so would reduce some sentencing, and another would automate the expungement process. So for some nonviolent offenses, when essentially when your years past the offense, as an individual, you can apply to have your record expunged, but it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. A lot of people don't have the resources to do it or even know that they can. And so this would automate that process for you. Both those bills passed through committee with wide support. So we're still seeing some early signs of support for criminal justice reform bills, even though the idea, at least nationally amongst conservatives, is maybe been cooled a bit.
Well, I mean, I kind of understand that, right? Like after George Floyd and all some of these highly publicized cases that sparked an outcry across the country, there was this whole movement to quote unquote defund the police. And I haven't seen that really succeed in a lot of places. And even, say like in Norman, where people have said, oh, they defunded the police. The police is still funded. There's still money there for the police. But I could see why in an election year, conservatives might be a little gun shy to venture down the criminal justice reform path, because they might fear that it takes them too close to looking like they're, tying the hands of law enforcement, tying the hands of police, when, their base ultimately is very supportive of law enforcement, police, funding for all of those things.
Yeah, I spoke with a representative from Southeast Oklahoma this week, who has proposed a bill, Representative Jim Brago, a Republican, who's proposed a bill that would lower the threshold of methamphetamine possession. So basically would make the penalty more strict. And I asked him, I said, are you hearing from your constituents that we need to do more on criminal justice reform? And he said, no, I'm hearing the opposite. I think I don't hear people saying we're locking up too many people. I hear people saying we're not locking up enough people. So there's still some pockets of the state where this tough on crime rhetoric is still pretty strong. And you're seeing that with some of the bills that have been filed. One thing that was interesting in doing some research for the story, I found a story from the Oklahoman from 1994 during the gubernatorial race, when there were three main candidates, including Frank Keaton, who ultimately won. And the story I read was about how all three were trying to compete with each other to see who could be the toughest on crime. And Governor Keating, a candidate at the time, said, I will never allow someone to get out of prison early. Even if our prisons are overcrowded, I'll just never do it. And it was just kind of language that you haven't heard a lot of these days in recent years. But one thing he also said, or one of the candidates said in the story, was we've been listening to the social scientists too much, who say that, that this is that crime is a societal issue, and really it's just because people have evil hearts. At least that's paraphrasing the quote there, that this one candidate said. And I don't know that I've heard that extreme of language, but I am hearing some lawmakers start to say that again, like, we've been listening too much to the social scientists. Prison is still our best bet when we're fighting crime. And it'll be interesting to see what the criminal justice reform conversation looks like in the coming years and in the coming months. As you're right, this is an election year, and that's definitely going to impact the debate.
Do you feel like, as you've said before, that the criminal justice reform in Oklahoma specifically has kind of petered out in recent years? Do you think there is enough energy for something big to happen this year, or do you think it'll take a while?
Well, I've often said that I think, and I hear this from advocates, that the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. And that's, not to say that like sentencing reform and some of the other major all was easy. It's probably not fair to call it low-hanging fruit. But some of the easier reforms have been achieved. And now we're getting to the point where it's a harder lift. It's a harder ask. And I think voters and lawmakers will say, all right, we did it. Now, where are the results, right? And there is this rhetoric that crime is on the rise. And there are some types of crime that have increased nationally in recent years. And there's been some reasons for that, some related to the pandemic. But overall, violent crime is still on the decline in Oklahoma. But that's not the rhetoric that we hear. And so I think it's hard for some to say, hey, we passed all these reforms, but yet we're seeing crime go up. Maybe we went too far. And I think a lot of the things that we have to do now are harder. And one thing, an interesting comment that was made in the Senate Judiciary Committee meeting from a couple weeks ago was Senator Mary Bourne, a Democrat from Norman. She said, listen, the work we have to do now, when we start taking a look at sentencing that we need to reform and change, we're not gonna feel comfortable. Like, it's gonna be hard for us to do that because it never feels right, or it doesn't often feel right for us to lessen a punishment for a crime, especially when you think about there being a victim involved. But she said, the status quo hasn't been working, so we have to do something, and it's just gonna be hard work. So I do think that the work on the criminal justice reform effort is harder now. I also think it's more complicated now, and the legislature doesn't sometimes do complicated very well. And nobody does, right? Voters don't do complicated very well. I mean, people want something that sounds easy. And I think from a few years ago, the poster child for the reforms we saw was often, women who were in prison because of drug offenses. And it was easier to say, listen, do we really want to punish not just women, men and women, but especially women who have an addiction and who made a mistake, but don't necessarily deserve to be in jail, especially when you think of the impact that has on their family and their community. That wasn't as complicated a message to receive, and it was embraced by voters, it was embraced by the legislature, and it was embraced by the governor. But now we're starting to get to a point where it is a little bit more complicated, and I think it's always, the more complicated things are, the harder it is to relay that message.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. What was it? State Question 805 that was on the ballot in 2020. I mean, this is my personal hunch, but I think that was so confusing that I don't know that Oklahomans support that state question or what it was trying to do. But I think the criminal justice element of it was so confusing that average Oklahomans could not easily understand it. And so their inclination was to vote against it.
Yeah, and we were hearing,
so things have just gotten complicated.
Yeah, and we were hearing from the law enforcement community that they were against it. And I think this is still a state where a lot of deference is given to the law enforcement community. And we saw, some in law enforcement several years ago that were in favor, spoke out in favor of some of these measures. But now we're not hearing that quite as much. And I think when a sheriff or a prosecutor says that, this bill would be bad for crime, it's going to be hard for some lawmakers to go against that word, especially in election year. I think that's the cloud, as we've talked about, that's the cloud over almost everything that's going to happen at the Capitol this spring. And that's definitely true with criminal justice reform legislation. Well, Carmen, here as we wrap up, I'm just kind of curious. I know you're finishing up some stories for the weekend and the week's not over, but when you look at next week at the Capitol, assuming that we do get together, that the weather is a little better, any particular issues that you're going to be following or paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think next week is going to be hectic because a lot of the stuff that got canceled this week will now roll over to next week. I think in light of the news we saw out of Texas this week, where basically AG Ken Paxton, he issued an opinion saying that, gender reassignment surgeries and for trans kids are basically akin to child abuse. And we saw Governor Greg Abbott of Texas also kind of double down on that and say that they're going to try to empower child protective services to crack down on families, parents that are allowing their kids to undergo hormone therapy or gender reassignment surgery or consult with doctors about gender reassignment surgery. We're seeing some of that here in Oklahoma. There's a bill that was supposed to be heard this week, and I presume will be heard next week, but would prevent doctors from performing gender reassignment surgeries on minors, and also could result in disciplinary action for doctors that do perform those surgeries. I think it boils down to a culture war type issue, but certainly LGBTQ plus folks are very concerned about legislation such as that, and they're concerned about what they saw in Texas this
Yeah.
week.
Well, as much as we don't like Texas, we often follow their lead in a lot of things when it comes to policy. So I think you're right to say if something that big or something that got that kind of attention down in Texas kind of has a ripple effect up to here. And yeah, there has been a lot of talk around some of those bills. And you're right, this is kind of part of a current culture war that's been ongoing, but seems to kind of really reinvigorated itself in recent months. So, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Political State Podcast. You can find this and every other episode by subscribing to Political State on your favorite podcast app. For more of the Oklahoman's journalism, you can find us at oklahoman.com. I know we've had some subscription specials going on this week. I think a Tuesday special that was going on is already over. It might be over by this point, but I guarantee you there's a special to be found for first-time subscribers. And I also have a link to subscribe in my Twitter feed at benfelder_OKC. So with Carmen Forman, I'm Ben Felder. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with you next week.